Okay, so we're going to start with why staff wellbeing matters, and as I say, it ties in very much to the sessions that we've already had earlier. But just a little look at the current climate then, and the sorts of things that are weighing maybe heavily on the education sector right now, and why kind of why really there is sort of so many, I don't want to say issues, but there's so many factors affecting what it means to work in education right now. We know, of course, we've got a cost of living crisis. We've got 31% of children living in poverty, which is around 9 children in a class of 30. And that's impacting heavily on schools and on teachers in the classroom. 1 in 5 children aged 8 to 16 have a mental health problem. That figure goes up to 1 in 4 post 16. So we're talking about a high percentage of children and young people who are experiencing mental health problems or have a parent who is experiencing mental health problems, if we look at that kind of adult figure as well. And certainly, as I said, I taught for 26 years, and being kind of in the psychology department, we were very tuned into what was going on around mental health, and that problem has kind of exacerbated and increased, and not least because of COVID as well, which kind of put a bit of a spanner in the works and blew up this problem. But that's a whole other workshop, that's a whole other webinar. But we've got that sitting on schools. We've got the increase of children with SEN needs. I'm actually delivering a session for the National Association of Special Schools this afternoon, and we know there is a growing need for special schools, but also there is a specialist provision needed in our mainstream school, which is an additional complexity. 65% of school leaders say parental complaints have increased. It was really good to see that the DFE is opening a sort of questioning process and a line of inquiry around this. Not sure if anybody's picked up on this, but it's happening next week, where you can give your lived experience, if you like. And I think it's really important that we do respond to this. It's something that's got to be kind of tackled at a larger, more national level than just every school sort of battling against this. And when we read all the data, I know Adurio have some fantastic data around this. We've also got the Teacher Wellbeing Index. The figures are showing that staff across all roles are reporting stress. So it kind of equates to around 78% across all roles, and increases to our top level staff, our senior leaders, to 84%. So that is, a huge amount of stress being reported. And I think if you look at the statistics around compared to sort of well-being of the general population, that people working in education score on average much poorer than other people across the UK. So, it's not a pretty picture. Added to that, our retention issues, our recruitment issues, and all sorts of other things that are going on. So we've got this picture here. And there's another figure that I feel is really interesting. And again, this has come from your teacher wellbeing, but actually I saw it reflected there in some of that data that was being shared from Ben, and also from Iona's thoughts around strategic priorities for TRUS. But actually, 50% of staff feel that culture has a negative effect on their well-being. And what we can kind of take from that figure really is that we know that culture can affect how staff are feeling, okay? And that kind of is really our starting point, because a lot of this stuff is beyond our control. A lot of this stuff we can lobby, and we can support the DfE, and we can, be careful with, our votes, and we can do all of this stuff. But that's a slow process of change. The mental health crisis, for example, amongst young people, is something that we cannot, on a school or trust level, instantly solve. But one of the things that we can do is that we can work on culture. And I have a real kind of rule in life that we just need to control the controllables. We have to do what's within our control. And so that kind of is where we need to start. We need to think about that we accept there's a wider picture that's weighing heavily on our staff, but actually we've got to do the things that we can to kind of support their ability to thrive and their ability to feel well. And it kind of is boiled down really to this lovely quote by John Thompson. John Thompson published a book along with Johnny Utley. I'd recommend that you read it, or if any of you would like to listen to our podcast, we interview both John Thompson and Johnny Utley. But they wrote this book, Putting Staff First, and they said that if we do not ensure first and foremost that our staff are happy, healthy, well qualified, highly motivated, hardworking, well-trained experts, they cannot be the best for their students. And I'm sure that's what's echoed in the white paper that Ben and Simon were talking about there. But that's basically what it all comes down to. And then we can turn it on its head, and we can look at the impact of investing in staff wellbeing. And again, this ties into those strategic priorities really that Iona was talking about. When you looked at those top trust strategic priorities, what you start to see is that staff wellbeing can go some way to kind of bringing those priorities to life. So the first one is when we invest in staff wellbeing. When I talk about investing, by the way, there might be a financial implication. But what I'm going to share with you this morning is really more about an approach as opposed to a cost-based investment. So the first thing that we do is when we invest in staff wellbeing, it's kind of got better outcomes for the individual. And I like to kind of broaden that out and think about that on a societal level. We're at work for around, I think they estimate 90,000 hours of our life. Okay, I don't know how they come up with that figure. I'm sure it's a bit longer than that, but around 90,000. And we absolutely, every single person on this call, I'm sure would agree that our work affects us as individuals. Okay, our experience at work impacts on our health and well-being. And that impacts on our families, it impacts on our relationships, it impacts on the health services that we have to access, and it has a broader impact on society as a whole. So when we're thinking about, looking after our staff and making sure that staff wellbeing is at the heart of what we're doing, then, it's obviously of benefit to those individuals within the organisation. Also know that good staff wellbeing has a link to improved job satisfaction and improved productivity. So if you're looking at it through an organisational lens, staff are more likely to be satisfied in their job. And I think Simon and Ben, you were looking at those figures around, whether people would recommend their workplace. But we know when they feel well, they feel supported, they feel valued, they feel like they're thriving. It improves job satisfaction and improves productivity, which from an organisational perspective, obviously is key. It can also go a long way around the retention and the recruitment. Because in terms of retaining staff, if staff feel valued, they want to stay. But also I think that retention piece is not necessarily about just getting staff staying still, but actually providing a kind of soil or a foundation or a base where staff can thrive and reach their full potential. And actually that might mean that they are moving on. But if they are moving on and they are getting promotions or they're seeking other opportunities, but they leave with a really positive experience of that school or trust. And of course, that has benefits for recruitment as well. And being able to report on your staff survey, in your job ads, around staff wellbeing is a huge draw factor for potential employees. Improve culture, obviously, when you're kind of supporting people on an individual level, that has a knock-on effect of the culture. So we're going to talk a little bit about individual well-being and organisational well-being, because they're part of the same jigsaw. And you know, that kind of culture piece grows when everybody is actively involved in making sure that staff wellbeing is a priority. And I always say that, you know, staff are the wallpaper of any organisation, and sometimes when I go into schools or I go into trusts and I'm talking with staff, they often think the culture exists somewhere external to themselves. And then don't always necessarily recognise that they are part of creating that culture. So obviously when staff are thriving, that has positive impacts on the culture. And obviously it has positive impacts on the learning, as the kind of happy staff, happy pupils white paper is intimating, is implying, because when we have staff who are available and are functioning in their role, they're less likely to be absent, they're more likely to be present, and in that case, you've got that consistency for students, which is key, and it can also have a positive impact on attainment. I know you brought up some data there, but we know that thriving staff can impact on attainment, and we also know that there's research that supports the converse is true. If children and young people are being taught by staff who are highly stressed, lacking in motivation, it has a converse negative impact on their attainment. But I also think that there's a round impact of role model in there as well. I think as adults in an education space, whatever your role, you are there to role model what it means to be a fully functioning adult. And I don't mean that means skipping down the corridors like Pollyanna all of the time. It's not about that, but it's about being able to role model emotional regulation, you know, making well-being a priority and how to do that, how to manage stress. All of those things are actually within the remit of the adults who are in that education setting. So, you know, that kind of trickle, that kind of drip down effect, that ripple effect is really important. There's a financial impact if we're retaining our staff. If there's reduced sickness, then obviously that's going to have a financial impact. And we look at the figures sometimes with trusts and with organisations, and we look at the financial impact of sickness or absence or replacing staff. And actually, if we just upped the volume on the investment being made in staff wellbeing and looked at that strategy, even if it just had a really small percentage impact, it would have a big impact financially. It's a really interesting exercise to do. And if anyone's interested in the tool to do this, I'm happy to send it out to you where you can kind of run a few figures through if that would be of interest. And last but not least, it is a priority for Ofsted as well. So I hope that gives you a little bit of a case as to why we need to be investing, and it builds on that work from Iona and Ben and Simon. So that's the kind of why, and I'm sure that none of that was much of a surprise. But I'd like to move on now and get into the what is well-being. And I think, you know, when I first did my psychology degree back in a long time ago, 1991, I think, we weren't talking about well-being in psychology. Far from it. It's a fairly new word that's being used, and it's one that we're using an awful lot. However, it's fairly ill-defined. It's what we call in psychology a fuzzy concept. And I think that there are lots of people doing things that they think are well-being, and they're probably right. But I also think that people misunderstand, and some people have a view that it is a soft thing that we should be doing. And certainly, I've worked with organisations where key people have definitely thought that it's something that everybody just needs to pull themselves together a little bit, and crack on. We used to call it the Lemonian school of thinking in my old college. So I want to just kind of leave that just sitting for a moment. What is well-being? Do you know what your definition is individually? And as well as your individual definition, what is your shared definition as a school or a trust? And if you're not quite sure, my first recommendation to you is this is where you start. Okay, start with deciding what that is and make sure that definition is really widely shared and understood, because often there's things that are being done in schools and trusts that are of benefit to well-being, but because people think that well-being is potentially a half day off at the end of term to do yoga, they think that their well-being is not being looked after. So that clarity of definition is absolutely where it starts. You can go a step further, and rather than deciding kind of at the top what well-being is, decide collectively of what well-being at work means to you and your school and your trust, because language is so important. Language defines our experience. You could actually take that a step further, and we kind of encourage this when I'm working either in sort of a consultancy capacity, or I'm working with leaders and training them into how to embed well-being, and map out what good well-being looks like. Map out what a good day looks like. What does a good day look like for a member of staff in our school community, where we're meeting the needs of their well-being? And talk to people, build up that picture. We do that in sales. Well, I don't work in sales, but if you work in sales or you're working in marketing, that's what they do. They kind of build that out. And I would recommend that you do that as a starting point. So I'm not sure whether you've just had a moment to think about what we mean by well-being, or what your definition is, or what your trust or schools is. But I'm going to share a definition with you here that I think is a really easy definition to work with. And it's modelled on the World Health Authority definition, but it's been adopted and tweaked a bit by the Education Staff Wellbeing Charter, the DFE Charter. Now, again, I'm not sure if any of you are signed up to the DFE Charter. Last time I checked, I think it was around 3,000 organisations, and it's been around since 2021. So there's a lot of schools and a lot of trusts not signed up for this charter, whether that's because they don't align with it, or whether that's because they don't know it exists. So perhaps that's something you could go off and check. And the Education Staff Wellbeing Charter has got lots of positives to it, and it's a great place to start. I think it lacks a little bit of meat on the bones, if I'm honest, but it can be a really good starting point when you're looking at sort of, key priorities and how you're going to move forward on well-being. But this is the definition that they use: a state of complete physical and mental health that is characterized by high quality social relationships. Okay, now I really like that as a definition. I think it's really simple, because it's basically saying that health, that wider definition of health or well-being, comprises of physical, mental, and social. They're your kind of three buckets. So when we're talking about well-being, we're talking about how do we as an organisation and how do we as individuals look after our physical, mental, and social well-being. And when I look at policies, which I do a lot, and I read kind of well-being policies, often the elements missing is social relationships. I would argue that that is key, particularly in an education setting. So again, something else you might want to take away from this session is to go and have a little look at your policies. Does it include social relationships? And if not, why not? Because, we work as a tribe. The kind of social connections that we have at work are the things that make us feel safe. When we feel safe, we can thrive. If we don't feel safe, we cannot thrive. So actually those social relationships can be the thing that can help us get through difficult time, that can help us navigate change, that can help and be supportive, that can help us flourish and thrive. We can learn from them. And that kind of needs to be really key. So that's a nice definition that you can use. But basically, a real broad definition of well-being is that people are feeling good and functioning well. Okay, and that is your broad definition. People are feeling good and functioning well. The second thing to say about the definition is to pick up on this idea of ill health. Again, when I work with a lot of organisations, what I might find is that their well-being strategy is actually focusing on ill health as opposed to well-being. So if we think about a normal distribution curve, love a normal distribution curve, within any given population or any given organisation, you're going to have a small amount of people at both ends of the spectrum. So a small proportion of people within your organisation will be experiencing ill health. That might be physical ill health, or it might be mental ill health. Now, it's absolutely imperative that is acknowledged, addressed, that there's supporting around that. And I think actually schools and trusts are doing really well around this area, training up kind of mental health first aiders, doing lots of kind of awareness raising around mental ill health. But that isn't just your wellbeing strategy. Wellbeing is the rest of the curve. Every single one of us has wellbeing. And that well-being kind of fluctuates. We might go, I've been a bit under the weather, so I'm probably not at my most thriving. So individual well-being kind of moves around in a kind of a little bit around this curve. So it's always fluctuating, but on any given day, we all have well-being. Around 14% of the population are thought to be thriving. And that's, as I said earlier, my area of interest is understanding what are the conditions that help people to thrive. Once we understand the conditions, we can start to embed those conditions, and that's going to enable other people to thrive as well. Now, in any given strategy and anything you do in the workplace, you are not going to instantly improve well-being and move everybody from okay to thriving. It's too big a responsibility, and work isn't the only factor that feeds into well-being. Okay, so I think kind of a better way to think about it is think about how are we going to focus on making well-being a priority? How are we going to put a bit of tender, loving care around our thoughts around well-being, rather than aiming for lofty heights of that kind of significant improving? And I appreciate that brings with it these issues around measuring. How do you measure the impact of something? And that's where I think this survey-based, you work with a jury, and those surveys become really key, because they are a way of measuring how people feel, which is maybe a little bit more of a kind of qualitative approach to measuring well-being, but it's definitely not an easy win. But what is well-being? It's functioning and feeling well. And well-being isn't just mental ill health. And I think that staff need some sort of education piece around that. My next question that I'd pose to you is, who is responsible for wellbeing at work? So again, the work that we do with trusts and schools, we kind of go into to the trust, and we either support leaders to be able to have these conversations, or we go in and open these conversations. So after establishing what wellbeing is, my second question is, who is responsible for wellbeing at work? And this is a really interesting question to ask staff. And as you can imagine, there's a variety of answers, but often the sorts of things that come out are SLT is responsible for my well-being, HR is responsible for my well-being, the mental health first aid lead is responsible for my well-being. The funniest one is when people start naming people. So Sandra is responsible for my well-being. And you know, that's not wrong, but it needs to be opened up into a conversation of what is everybody's responsibility, and what is their role around well-being. And these are sort of the definitions that we use. I'm going to share our definition with you in a minute, but going back to that DfE Wellbeing Charter, they state that the DfE, employers, governing bodies, senior leaders and individuals are responsible for staff wellbeing. And what we're kind of advocating is that every single person within any given organisation and any given culture has a responsibility. And I think it's super important that that message is given out, but then it's also discussed what sits under everybody's responsibility. And that's kind of really empowering when you kind of give people that sort of ownership, and you recognise that it's everybody's responsibility. And the Anna Freud Centre backs that up as well. What I love about the Anna Freud Centre definition is that they talk about it being a partnership, and they bring in parents as well. Parents, carers and wider community. Now, parents, carers and the wider community aren't, you know, they aren't necessarily responsible, but they have impact, and therefore with that impact comes responsibility. And if we go back to the beginning, we said that parental complaints are on the increase, and one of the key reasons why people are experiencing stress within education right now. I think there is a duty around sharing with parents the importance of staff wellbeing, why that some of the decisions that you're going to make around communication, around accessibility, and why that kind of centres on staff wellbeing, and that there is a duty to protect those staff so they can continue to thrive, to look after the children and young people. So we've worked with all sorts of trusts, kind of helping them with that sort of messaging and thinking about what that looks like. And in fact, I'm delivering a session tomorrow for parents, and just kind of buying into that. How do we empower parents more? How do we kind of get them to take a more proactive role rather than just thinking the school can solve all the problems? And how can we get them to see that actually, if everybody plays their role, then that's when we're going to achieve this kind of staff wellbeing. So it stops being the HR director's responsibility. It stops being a single person's responsibility, and everybody is kind of buying into this notion that wellbeing matters. And if we believe that wellbeing matters, what are we all going to do as a collective about it? So in our training, we kind of bring it down to this. And as I say, this is an hour's version of what I'd probably deliver over 2 days or in a fairly lengthy consultancy. But that workplace wellbeing is the product of individuals taking responsibility for their own wellbeing. That's first and foremost. I would love it if somebody came round, cooked my tea, did my washing, stopped my kids from arguing, and you know, wash my bed every day, so I can get into my nice linen and, you know, put me to sleep. But actually, at the end of the day, that's my responsibility. I've got to take that responsibility around boundaries, around how I care for myself, around taking regular breaks, making sure that I'm well rested. I've got to take some of that responsibility. But I also think as individuals, we've got to recognise the impact that we have on others. And that's really powerful when you talk to people about that. And recognise that the way you behave, the way that you interact, the way that you communicate can impact significantly on somebody else's well-being. And that's a really interesting conversation to have as well. So individuals have to take responsibility. And then you've got the kind of organisational approach. And this kind of comes into that sort of organisational psychology. How do we then, as an organisation, support that? How do we build those foundations so that our staff can thrive, whilst acknowledging that individuals have to take some of that responsibility as well? And we sum it up through they need to promote good wellbeing, protect good wellbeing, and help restore good wellbeing. And that's sort of our framework that we use. So I'd like to spend a little bit of time now kind of going through each of those. You promote, you protect, you restore, and maybe give you a few ideas of if you're thinking about how you approach. I mean, it's a gorgeous time of year, isn't it? From that planning perspective, but a gorgeous time of year. How many of you just rolled your eyes? I've clearly forgotten what it's like to be in a school in June, haven't I? But I think my point being there is it's a great time of year to be having this conversation and thinking about how you can roll this out come September. So yeah, let's look at kind of the grassroots and the nuts and bolts and the things that sort of feed into good workplace well-being. Just before I do that though, I want to kind of give a little bit of a what it's not. Doing well-being isn't one-off well-being activities. It's not cake in the staff room. It's not yoga. But that's not to say that they're not part of the picture. I don't think we need to be demonising schools and trusts who, you know, do a lovely job of providing cake on a Friday and regular yoga sessions, because actually they are a huge part of the picture. And for some staff, they are, you know, really welcomed and really appreciated. I suppose the difficulty comes that if the culture is not conducive to thriving, if there are, you know, unaddressed issues that are contributing to poor staff well-being, and then a yoga session is put on, then actually that can do more harm than good. So they're part of the picture, but actually we need to be careful that we don't undermine the wider sense of well-being and think about how these things can be used sort of strategically in our approach to staff well-being. Very quickly, because we've talked about culture in the last couple of sessions, how do we build a culture? Again, this is a real kind of quick version of it. We always refer to the culture triangle, the artifacts at the things at the top. These are the things that you say that you do. These are your school logo, your motto, your kind of maybe even put policies in there as well, your kind of wider communication of who you are as a school and a trust and what you're saying about well-being. Sitting underneath that is the values, whether those values, and I'm a really keen advocate of having real clarity around values and making sure that they're like a values at the heart of what you do, a values-led culture where everybody understands what those values are and those values are lived and breathed in everything that you do is really, really powerful. So the values piece sits underneath that. But actually the thing that drives culture is the basic underlying assumptions, the lived experience of every single person within your organisation, the kind of how we do things around here. And I think it was you, Simon, who said, you know, culture eats strategy for breakfast. You can push a strategy up here, but if the lived experience for your staff does not match that, then it's not going to drive culture. It's not going to drive it from up here. It's about kind of looking, right, what are those conditions, those foundations, the basic experience of everybody who works here. That is what you build your culture on, those micro daily moments. So how do we do that? Well, we can bring in this kind of promote, protect, restore model around well-being. And kind of think about how you could build that up into that lived experience every single day that isn't just that one-off half-day treat at the end of the year. Okay, so when we're thinking about promoting then, we're thinking about the things that we need to do that signal we're serious about well-being. And this needs to be kind of mapped throughout the year. There needs to be regular touch points. It can't be a wellbeing policy that's produced at the beginning of the year and shared. It kind of has to go much deeper than that. So to actively promote wellbeing, it's got to be modelled from the top. There has to be buy-in from your senior leadership team. And hopefully some of the information I shared at the beginning and the work that Adurio and Iris are doing, there's your collective case, if you like. Everybody's got to see that wellbeing is important. Everybody's got to believe in it, and everybody's got to model that in what they do. because the leaders shape culture. Not the only thing that shapes culture. And I think that's an awful lot to have on the shoulders as leaders, but that's where it's modelled from. And for that reason, when you're looking at any strategy, I think it's super important that you also look at how the well-being of senior leaders is being supported. Again, I often see that that's missing. How are we making sure that our senior leaders' well-being? You cannot just ask senior leaders to model well-being without giving some sort of support to their well-being. The second thing is to make sure that staff well-being is front and centre in all policies and systems. If a new policy is being implemented, has staff wellbeing been considered? Has the impact on staff been considered? I think where it's particularly true is in the systems, when any new sort of system is being introduced. Because what tends to happen with systems is that it's a bit like layering up a blanket, isn't it? We bring in a system that's going to make everything better, and we layer that in a blanket across our education. It might be a HR system, it might be a kind of MIS system, it might be a registering system, and we lay on that blanket. The problem is, what we often forget to do is that we remove the blanket below, and we can end up just piling so much on and kind of making people feel overheated, overwhelmed, that it ends up being a stressor. So make sure that anything new that's coming in, put it through a lens of staff wellbeing. What is the impact on staff here? And I've worked with a great principal locally who does a kind of, any new system, I'm going to look at this and I'm going to play with this system in the perspective of the person who's going to be using it. Whether that's somebody in admin, whether it's a busy teacher, what does it feel like? I'm going to spend a day in their shoes or a few hours in their shoes. How does it feel? So take a systems approach. Empower and educate. I think it's really important to make sure that if we're asking staff to play a role in looking after their well-being, there has to be some education piece around that. I don't think we can expect staff to be able to understand how to look after their well-being in the middle of a busy working day in the context of 2025. And I also think there's a big gap, isn't there? Nobody told me about well-being. Nobody even told me I had to go for a walk or a run or drink water or eat some kale. That wasn't part of my education. And I certainly wasn't educated around my well-being, my mind. You imagine if somebody in the 1970s told me I had a mind that needed looking after as well. So we can't just assume that staff know. So what's your education piece? Do they know how to manage the emotional load of their role? Do they know how to emotionally regulate so that they can co-regulate? Do they know how to pour energy back in the middle of a busy working day? Do they know the kind of importance of rest and sleep? So I think that education is really key, as is empowering staff to make sure that they know how to look after their well-being. And empower the parents as well. Again, I think that's your other parent piece. Do they know how to support their child, their young person, in order to look after their well-being? And do they as individuals know how to look after their well-being? Promote balance, that kind of thing around boundaries that can be modelled, encourage staff to have a healthy kind of work-life balance, get them to recognise that good is good enough, but make sure those things are clearly communicated, because often I think that it can be thought that we've got these kind of clear things in place, but actually is that the lived experience of staff? Is it a culture where staff feel guilty if they leave at 4 o'clock because they've got to pick up their children? When I had young children, I needed to leave on the dot of 4. I then did my work later on because that worked for me. But I felt guilty every single day. I was worried that people thought I wasn't working hard enough. So what are we doing around, it's not just children, it's hobbies, it's life, it's parents. What are we doing to make sure that that balance is promoted? Staff voice, and this ties in beautifully to what Iona was saying, and the difference between just listening and hearing. Make sure that is part of what you do. Often when we talk to staff, they say communication is an issue. It's not that they're not being told things, it's that they don't feel heard. And we know that with any change, with anything that we're bringing in to drive culture, it is better if it is co-created rather than commanded. So bring that staff voice in, bring it into your wellbeing piece. EDI plays a whole role in staff wellbeing. How is that approached with staff? We're often very good at doing kind of things around student experience. How do you promote and educate around things like neurodiversity amongst staff, around menopause? You know, our female staff is at the highest demographic. What are we doing around that education piece? It's something I'm very passionate and do a lot of work around. Bring your whole self to work day. How are you kind of celebrating staff as individuals and whole humans? And make sure that that strategy or charter is a living, breathing document. Okay, you've got your wellbeing policy that's often just sat behind everything, but how is that strategy and charter being brought to life? Do staff know it, feel it, understand it? Can they recite it? Is it regularly brought up? Is it brought up into line management meetings? How is it being used, and make sure that it is part of the experience of staff? Sorry, I'm going at a pace here, aren't I? Okay, so in terms of protecting then, I always go Maslow. You can't go wrong if you go Maslow. Start with the basics first. Make sure the staff can get a drink of water when they've only got a 3-minute break. Make sure if they're staying for parents' evening that they've got access to decent food, that they've got to have a drink somewhere along the line. Make sure that breaks are protected where they can be, or at least rotated, and that staff are encouraged to have a break, not eat al desco, that they're encouraged, there's an outdoor space, that they're resting. And make a big show of that those physical needs matter. Because I would argue they're like, you know, I remember that I worked for an organisation that gave free tea and coffee, which was just fabulous. And they stopped it. And for financial reasons, and I understand all of that, the impact that had on staff morale was huge, huge. Because staff could no longer, you'd get down to the staff room, you'd forget to bring your coffee within you, you know, in you, you'd steal somebody else's, and so make sure those basic needs are met in the conditions of every single day. Psychological safety is huge. Again, I could do a full workshop about this. I think it's key. And I think teachers are incredibly good at doing this for their students. In the classroom, they're building a safe space. It's safe to get things wrong. It's safe to make mistakes. It's safe to say that we're just learning, we're growing, we're not there yet. And it's safe to be vulnerable. The trick is, to any sort of organisation where staff are going to thrive, is making that the same for staff. Because as I alluded to earlier, you know, at the end of the day, as human beings, really fundamentally, all we want to do is feel safe. And when we feel safe, we can thrive. I think that brings in your training element. Are managers and leaders trained in how to create psychological safety within their team? I think middle managers play a key role. Often you can get the culture being led from the top. And in Sandra's team, they're all having a whale of a time. But in David's team over here, they're all struggling and there's issues. So are your managers trained in how to manage well-being, how to lead a thriving team? So that training element. Bringing your governors, I think, is important as well. Do they know how to ask questions about well-being? Do they know what well-being is? Are they able to play a supportive role? Encourage connections and positive emotions. We go back to that social well-being. What does that look like? And you know, it might be that you do things around staff socials, and they're great. A social committee is lovely, and there might be a group of people who enjoy and have a tribute night in the local hotel, and that's great. But actually, how do you build those connections for the people who don't want to engage in that? What opportunities? How do you use your meeting times to build chance to connect and to experience positive emotions together? That bit is so key to building a thriving organisation. And how do you celebrate as well? How do you build that staff morale? And again, it needs careful consideration. Oops, sorry, I've dropped my glasses. One staff might love, we worked We worked with a leadership team, and we talked to one really disgruntled member of staff who, for the second in the year, row in the year, had been overlooked for Little Miss Sunshine, and she hadn't got the award. And she was fabulous, and she felt it was well deserved, but she felt like it was strategic who these awards were being given to, and actually the whole thing just felt like it was a really uncomfortable thing, that people thought was a bit political who was getting the awards, and some people hated the fact of going on stage. So think about your celebrations carefully. What do they look like? How do you meet the needs of making sure that people feel celebrated in a way that suits them? And how do you do that whole gratitude piece? CPD, super important, and I think somebody's going to talk about that today, or it's going to be mentioned. You know, how do you kind of embed a kind of individualized sort of CPD program that allows staff to thrive, feel invested in, that it's not just a blanket approach, everybody does the same training regardless of their needs or not. CPD is huge, as is flexible working actually, and I haven't got that on here, but I'm so pleased to see somebody's going to be talking about that later on. And there's loads of stuff on the DFE. There's a DFE toolkit around flexible working that you can download, and there's also people that you can get in and come and do a review and help you think about flexible workload across your school and trust and F1. But I'm going to not say any more about that because somebody else is going to. And then workload. Workload is a big thing. We know that it is. Our advice around workload, and we spend a lot of time on this. A colleague of mine did a PhD in looking at attrition from the education sector and focused a lot on workload. Again, there's the DFE toolkit you can download that's got some suggestions. But we always sort of say it's not just about quantity, it's about value. How are you measuring the value? How do you understand what the issue around workload is? Don't just assume it's hours worked. So again, that staff voice, that conversation, that workload survey, I think is really important to understand. And often it's those admin tasks that again have been alluded to earlier, and then we talked briefly about AI as a solution. How can you reduce that workload? And finally, address the drivers of stress. Addressing those drivers of stress is so important. Educating staff how to manage stress is one thing, but do you understand what the stresses are in the first place? Again, that survey tool can be really useful here. Do you understand the drivers? Are there any drivers that can be mitigated? Not all drivers can. Sometimes it's just the nature of the work. For example, change and unpredictability are key things that cause people stress. But working in the education space, they are two things that are incredibly inevitable. But make sure that you understand. And again, I think there's a HSE education toolkit. If anybody wants any of these links that I've kind of thrown at you, I'll put my email address in the chat and email me, and I'm happy to send you through any links or any documents to support you. And finally, it's the restoration piece, and this is around helping to restore and support people with mental ill health. That's your signposting, your regular kind of making sure that staff know where they get counselling, or if you've got an EAP, how is that signposting done? Make sure you've got people who know how to respond to people in a crisis, and that whole mental illness awareness piece. Again, that tends to be what I see in organisations is done really well. I'm going to skip past this because we've run out of time, and just so that we've got a couple of minutes for questions, I'm going to just leave it on that screen just to say that fundamental to all of this, anything that you're doing around action planning or strategy, it starts with recognising that staff matter, and that's every single staff in the building. And when you put that at the heart of your conversations and your plans, then that's where you're going to build that kind of foundational roots that allow people to thrive and flourish. Right, I am going to stop there, I think. So I'd like to open it to any questions. I know we've just got a couple of minutes. If anybody's got any questions or comments, please do feel free to ask.
Thank you so much, Julie. Whilst people are gathering their questions, I had one. So you were talking on one of the slides about kind of leadership modeling, well-being. And one thing that I kind of struggle with in my role as a leader, is how do you strike that balance between kind of modeling it, and particularly at times when people are, it's either a particular area, time of high workload, or maybe the culture is such that everyone is kind of frequently overwhelmed. If you're going to be the kind of first one going and sort of saying, I'm going to go and model my well-being, I'm going to go and leave early and make sure that I'm prioritizing myself, and so on, how do you do that in a way that kind of doesn't feel out of touch and kind of make it worse, the feelings of others?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Iona. And I think that's where the collective conversations have to come in. I think that there is a real key need to make well-being part of the agenda and to have those conversations and to like actively say, that I am going to lead and I am trying to kind of model good well-being, and this is what it looks like for me. And on a good day, you might see me leaving early or on time. And I think it's just being part of that co-creation strategy is really, really key, because otherwise, as you say, the modelling can be a bit incongruent with the actual culture and the system. But I can't stress enough about how staff need to feel part of this journey. And I think if they feel part of it and they feel like they understand and they feel that what everybody's responsibility is, it takes a little bit of that pressure off that, I think, Iona. But I think it's a really valuable question, and could easily be got wrong, I think.
Mm. So
Yeah,
almost kind of acknowledging the challenge, and sort of being, yeah, very open.
definitely. And I am all around. And I think that when you do that, what you do as well is you sort of help create that culture of psychological safety. If you can be a bit vulnerable and a bit authentic and kind of say, I'm really going to struggle with this, I'm really going to struggle because I want to make sure that you kind of understand, but this is going to be difficult for me because this is what I'm going to worry about. I think that honest conversation needs to be on the table. And, and that's where you're going to get that, I think, that buy-in and that kind of movement, that change around well-being.
Great.
Thank you for that.
Thanks. Yeah, we've got a couple of questions. I'll read both of them, and then you can kind of address in either both at the same time, or you can pick which one to go first. So Claire asks, are there any other charters other than the DFE Wellbeing Charter that you would recommend? And Zoe also asks, I don't think she's going to hear the answer, but we can gather it up and get it across to her. She asks, how do you recommend helping staff with their wellbeing in the increases of physical and emotional assaults from pupils?
Okay, I'm gonna just to answer Claire's question first. Um, to be honest, Claire, there's not a big kind of accessible bank of charters. There's a few trusts who have their charters on visible on their websites, and I'm happy if you want to drop me a line. I'm happy to share who they are. My advice, though, around any charter building, and again, this is something that we go in on a kind of consultative, is bring a wide, diverse team in and kind of bring that team in that's got governors, senior leaders, mental health first aid leaders, a parent if you can, to help shape that charter, and then share that draft with your staff and get their feedback. Because again, the charter can become feeling like we're being done to rather than being kind of listened. So I'd involve your full staff body in developing that charter. Is my recommendation there. But yeah, have a little look at what other trusts are doing. The DFE one is a good place to start, but I'm happy to give any more advice or support around that if I can. The question around the increase in physical or emotional assaults, I'm going to say, is probably outside of my remit in this kind of conversation. I think it's a really, really good question. But I think I'd probably like a little bit more time to be able to reflect and respond to that one, if I'm really honest. I definitely think it needs some work around it. And I think the second one is we're seeing an increase in aggression from parents, which can be challenging for frontline staff. How do we raise awareness of the impact of behaviour with parents? We have a parent code of conduct and a home school agreement communicated annually. Yeah, again, it's really hard, Una, because you're kind of trying to turn around a large boat here, aren't you? We know that has increased. I was up at a trust yesterday, and the CEO is leading on that, and she's trying to get kind of that regular parental communication around making them understand the impact and making them understand the role of staff in education and around supporting their children and their young people. Parent empowerment workshops. Again, it's difficult, isn't it? Because you could run a parent empowerment workshop and you get all the people who don't really need it, and the people who do need it don't rock up. So, it's a challenging one, but I'd say it's worth doing something, and it's worth trying to keep moving that journey forward, really, around that communication, around, little bits on your newsletter, whatever that looks like, and think about maybe bringing in some parent empowerment sessions as well.
Great stuff. I think that's the last question we've got written, and we're also out of time and time to go to the next one. But Julie, are there any kind of closing remarks you'd like to share before we go to hear from some others?
No, I think that's it, really. But yeah, as I say, it can feel a challenge when you're thinking about staff wellbeing, and I think it can be hard to think where are you going to start. But hopefully I've given people just a few pointers there, a bit of a structure that they can use to start thinking about it. And obviously, please do get in touch if I can support in any way, shape or form. So thank you very much for your time this morning.